Welcome to the TrueNicks Top 10 Myths About Nicks in Thoroughbred Breeding webinar. Have you ever met someone at the sale or at the races who had a crazy theory about thoroughbred breeding? The story, however, sounded so convincing that you repeated it to a friend, who told a coworker, who then passed it along to a business partner. Before long, the thoroughbred industry had created another urban legend. Byron Rogers and Alan Porter, the co-founders of the TrueNicks rating system, have noticed several common misconceptions about thoroughbred nicking and want to help you sort out the facts from the myths. Alan has been professionally involved with thoroughbreds for nearly 35 years. He has authored racing and breeding analyses for 3 decades and has been planning matings for a quarter century. Byron comes from a strong Australian racing background, his family having raced some top-flight gallopers in that country. He spent 8 years with Arrowfield Stud in Australia as stallion nominations and bloodstock manager, and has worked as director of the stallion division at Tailor Made Farm in central Kentucky and with the William Inglis & Sons Sales Company. Byron and Alan are also partners in Pedigree Consultants, a mating research company.
Welcome to the TrueNicks webinar. My name is Byron Rogers. This is my partner Alan Porter.
Hi.
Today we're going to be talking about an offshoot for the TrueNicks white paper, which you can download on TrueNicks.com and is also available in a link below this webinar. For those of you that are following this, we won't be going in exact order, but we'll be certainly trying to cover all the topics mentioned.
Okay, Byron, let's get started. Our first myth is, all systems that evaluate sire line affinities use basically the same data and the same calculations.
I think that people have got to understand how this is actually calculated and the speed that this is calculated at. If we are looking at literally millions of records in one go, the TrueNicks calculation is able to, with the speed of computers, we wouldn't normally have been able to do this up until the last few years. We're able to gather that data very quickly and make the calculation.
TrueNicks is completely unique. It's the one and only system that has access to the complete database of the Jockey Club. The Jockey Club have the most comprehensive database of records available. And that means TrueNicks is the only program that can be based on the number of foals and the number of starters on a cross, therefore the only program based on true opportunity. It also means that the calculations that we use, which are opportunity-based calculations, can't be duplicated by any other program.
The use of restricted stakes winners makes ratings less accurate.
No, that's not so. We found that when we looked at the pedigrees and the stakes winners in restricted programs, that there's no change in the accuracy of the nick rating when we study those apart. It also needs to be borne in mind that programs that pride themselves on eliminating American restricted stakes winners are including stakes winners from some very obscure countries. For instance, they're not including the Queen's Plate in Canada, they're not including the Japanese Derby, but they're including races in Sicily, they're including races in Tasmania. So even those systems which probably claim to be more pure or elitist are really having horses that are inferior to an awful lot of American restricted stakes winners. Secondly, when you look at horses in regional programs, and I mean we've had some exceptional horses in regional programs like Not for Love and In Excess, who for the last 10 years have probably been the best 2 stallions outside of Kentucky. If you take out regional restricted stakes winners that they've had, say Not for Love stakes winners in the Maryland program, In Excesses in the California program, you lose over 50% or around 50% of their stakes winners. Well, I'm hard pressed to understand how eliminating the better part of half a horse's stakes winners are going to give you a more accurate reflection of how well he works and how the crosses work.
Nicks are only for American breeders because they don't take into account race records from other countries.
Well, we've already mentioned we've got the complete database of the Jockey Club, and in fact, we take into account everywhere where there is licensed and recognized racing by the international racing authorities. We consider every black type race that's given black type by the International Cataloguing Standards Committee. So the database and the calculations are based on racing the world over. Now, to give you a couple of examples, in Europe you have an Irish Derby winner, Fame and Glory, who's by Montague, an Irish foaled stallion. Out of an English foaled mare from a German family, he rates A. You go to the other side of the world and you've got Montague's stable companion Galileo in Australia. And out of an Australian bred mare, he can sire a horse that's rated an A. So, you know, the program's working the world over. It's producing results that are consistent for those stallions in the geographic regions they stand, and which are then transmitted and can be understood and reflected on into other parts of the world. So, you see More Than Ready working well with Danehill in Australia, then you have the chance to look at More Than Ready with other Danzig line stallions in America. In fact, he's worked with Langfru's an American stallion. Actually, yeah, because we did find it very, very accurate for Australian stallions. You might have something to say on that.
Yeah, I think
as somebody's experience in the Australian breeding.
Yeah, the interesting thing about probably the shuttle phenomenon about horses coming down from overseas is that we do find the Nick ratings very much translate across hemispheres. Horses that rate well in America or American stallions, or horses that rate well in Europe, generally find the same or similar bloodlines will work in Australia and other places. So, from that perspective, the system works very well.
And certainly from a practical perspective, as somebody who plans matings the world over, and I've been sometimes challenged by a mating, with a mare with a South American bloodline in America, a mare with a European bloodline in Australia. I found the systems offered me some very, very useful options.
Yeah, obviously we discuss international breeding fairly frequently on the blog. Posts about Fame and Glory and other stallions and More Than Ready are always up to date. We tend to go back and look at these stallions at regular intervals and discuss this on an international basis rather than just localised to American breeders.
It's great news for breeders that these patterns are repeated all over the world. Here's the next question. Can't nicks be tweaked just to satisfy stallion owners who subscribe to the Nick rating system?
Well, as a former stallion manager, I can say I wish. The algorithm is held at the Jockey Club database. There's absolutely no input by anyone or any third party on the algorithm. As a result, the rating you get is what the computer spits out, and we do not have any control over that. So if you get a D rating, we're sorry. It's the way it goes.
But that is also good news for crosses rating an A. It means they're true A's. Okay, here's another myth. Nicks are never predictive. By the time a cross has been tried enough to earn its own rating, the success or failure of the cross is already well established.
Yeah, that's really not so. There's a very high tendency for sire lines to perpetuate themselves in the way that they cross, and for affinities to be continued down several generations of a male line. For example, Fapiano did very, very well within reality. Fapiano's sons, such as Unbridled, did well within reality line mares. Unbridled Song has done well within reality line mares, and now we're even seeing sons of Unbridled Song do that. So you've got a cross that's gone on 4 generations, which is even beyond the scope of how far back the Nick rating goes, and it's perpetuated itself and been consistently successful over several generations. And there's a very strong tendency for sire lines. In fact, we studied some sire lines, and we went back generations, and the horses that are based on crosses 2 and 3 generations back, there's no drop-off in accuracy from the crosses on TrueNicks that are based on the sire and the broodmare sire. The accuracy really doesn't diminish that much, which is surprising. Now, there are cases where a new Nick arises, a sire takes a different course than his own sire and grandsire. I mean, one case might be Point Given. And if we look at Point Given, that was a little bit predictable because phenotypically he's very different than Thunder Gulch. He's much more like his own broodmare sire, Turkoman. He started working very well with Seattle Slew Line mares, which Thunder Gulch and Gulch hadn't done. But one thing that TrueNicks did, it was able to reflect that very quickly. By the time he'd had 2 stakes winners on that cross and had formed his own new Nick, that was reflected instantly in TrueNicks.
A good example in reverse of that would be the tailor-made stallion forestry. Sons of Stormcat have in general been quite good with Mr. Prospector line mares, and probably looking at forestry, everyone thought, he will suit being from the same family. But actually, that's not the case. He does not work very well with Mr. Prospector. It's been tried a lot of times. The only Mr. Prospector line sire line he has worked well with is the Fapiano line. So, from TrueNicks' viewpoint, we were able to very quickly say, this does not work. What does work for forestry? He is a unique horse. He's different to most sons of Stormcat. And as a result, now you see with TaylorMade, they're able to manage that stallion a little bit better. They're avoiding sending Mr. Prospector line mares, barring quite American Fapiano line horses, mares, I should say. And that's going to help the stallion long term. And that's one of the big things for stallion managers, is that once their horse does establish some sort of affinity, using TrueNicks intelligently and saying to Some people that are breeders that are coming to them with matings that just aren't going to work and have proven that they don't work. It ends up eliminating the mares that would normally not produce a good horse for the stallion, and attracting mares that will. So therefore, getting their results, better results for these stallions, and that's what TrueNicks from a stallion manager's perspective is about.
Well, it's certainly useful to know what's not working. We want to remind you that Byron and Alan are available to take your questions during the webinar and afterwards until 3 p.m. You can submit your question below. Now let's go to the next one. Nicking systems wait until there's a big graded stakes winner and then conveniently change the rating to A++.
You go on that one.
Yeah, that's a similar question to the one that we had actually about tweaking the system. Again, we don't have the option to tweak the system as the ratings are generated by the Jockey Club. But we can use an example. Take that Mind That Bird. Mind That Bird was an A+ rated horse before he ever started in the Kentucky Derby. Now, he won the Kentucky Derby, but that did not change his rating since he's already a stakes winner. What TrueNicks does, TrueNicks is based on the percentage of stakes winners relative to opportunity. And so a new big winner that's previously been a stakes winner won't change the rating at all. Now, a new winner, a new stakes winner will change the rating, as it should, because it's increased the ratio of success. Now, one thing I will say about Mind That Bird, he was A+ rated before the race. He was A+ rated after the race. But if you'd have gone and run a TrueNicks rating 25 minutes after that race, you would have seen under the best winners, you would have seen that horse updated from an ordinary stakes winner to a Grade 1 winner. So that information is available on TrueNicks within half an hour of the race.
Just on the production of the rating, it generally takes a fair activity for the rating to go up. Like we have to have certain parameters where the stakes winners are out of 2 unique mares, and for that rating to move up. Ratings do change, they do vary, and it will take a couple of stakes winners for it to vary and to go up. And we talk, as Alan said, we talk about stakes winners. The quality of the stakes winner is not the determining factor. For them to degrade, obviously that Nick rating would have to be tried multiple times and have not much success. And in our experience, Nick rate, while they do change, they do not vary as much as you'd like to think they do. Actually, they do remain fairly constant within the grades, and that's important for people to understand.
How about the variance score that TrueNicks rating is based on? A variance score of 150 must be better than a score of 7.5, even though both rank A++. Isn't that right?
Yeah, there's a reason we put letter grades on these, and that's because the variance scores, while interesting, are a little difficult to interpret for most people. The thing to remember is that the way these numbers are generated does not give a linear progression. You don't get them improve in a straight line. They improve what's called exponentially, which is a steep curve. And the best way to think about it is that all the horses who have a rating that's under opportunity would be squeezed between 0.01 and 0.99. All the horses that are above opportunity would be 1.01 and could be up to 500 or 600. Now, usually we find a rating in the 500 or 600s is an example of where a stallion's had very limited opportunities with a broodmare sire and had success. For instance, you get examples where Unbridled Song has had 3 starters, I think, out of Olympio mares and 2 stakes winners and a stakes placed horse. So the cross hasn't been tried a tremendous number of times, but for the limited times it's been tried, it's been very successful. So it generates a very high number. When you come down to something like an AP Indy with Mr. Prospector mares, it still gets a high number, but it's been tried so many times you're going to get a 7 or an 8 rather than a 500 or 600. So what we did, we looked at the population, and we looked at the distribution of the population as a whole, and the distribution of the stakes winners, and the numbers, and we converted those ratings to that letter grade. And so really, whilst the number tells you how we arrived at the letter grade, the thing to look at is the letter grade. A's, A+, they're exceptional. B+ are very, very good. So really the thing to keep in mind is B+, A's, A+, A++. They're the elite of the breed. That group are producing about twice as many stakes winners as they would by chance, and that a very high number probably is a result of a nick that's shown tremendous success with very limited opportunity. But really isn't that there really isn't a lot of difference between a variant of a 7 and a variant of 150.
Alan, it sounds like there's a lot of very useful information on a TrueNicks report besides the letter grade. But it's been said that Nicks don't take into consideration the importance of other parts of the pedigree.
I say true.
And I say false.
Well, why would you say that?
Because it may be literally true. The nick doesn't measure the interrelation of the other parts of the pedigree. But nicks don't evolve purely because of the sires and the sire lines. In pure genetic terms, you may look at a horse some way back and say he contributes 12.5%, 25% or whatever to the pedigree. But what you tend to find is stallions tend to work the same way as their sons, tend to work the same way as their grandsons, that there is a tendency for sire lines to work the same way. And that's often because of the interrelation between the other parts of the pedigree. Sometimes it's because of inbreeding or line breeding that's there. For instance, we talked about the Fabiano in reality cross. That gave inbreeding to the best son and daughter rough and tumble. That's probably what caused the success of that cross. That's present all the way down the sire lines, even though it recedes a little bit into the pedigree. In other cases, you've got the fact that if Sadler's Wells works well over Mizwaki mares and works well over Shirley Heights mares, maybe those two horses have a common affinity. And what you're really looking at is common affinities that are being passed on down the line, not specific genetic contributions. So people who criticize nick ratings, whichever brand of nick ratings they may be, are criticizing them on the basis of saying, well, there's only X percentage of genetic contribution. What really happens in real life is that the success of the nicks and the ongoing success of the nicks through the extension of the sire lines is caused by affinities within other parts of the pedigree. So whilst TrueNicks doesn't literally measure the whole pedigree, the nick rating does tend to reflect a genetic affinity through other parts of the pedigree. Does that convince you?
Absolutely not. Well, in some respects it does. Look, I think the question, I think there's a certain element of truth to it. We don't consider the female line when we're making the calculation. And I can see that some people, especially those that believe in, and look, there's some factor to it with mitochondrial DNA. You cannot dismiss anything that the importance of the female line. And some people would argue that we don't look at, say, inbreeding to superior females. The one thing that we do know with TrueNicks is that we tried it. We looked over at 100,000 horses, and we found genetic affinity. I recall when we were developing it, sitting in a conversation with Scott Gillies, and he said, we talked about this, project that was going to cost us, how much it was going to cost us, and it was a lot of money. And Scott said, well, what if it doesn't work? And I said, well, you just spent a lot of money proving nicks aren't there. And that was, so fortunately for us, we've actually, when we actually did the program, we developed it, we ran statistical tests on it. It actually turned out that there is genetic affinity between sire lines and broodmare sire lines. It was provable, and it was something that had significant statistical significance.
So there are things going on in pedigrees that TrueNicks does reflect when they're significant, but it does seem broadly, if you're going to try and do a calculation across a large group of horses, that the male line nick is the strongest measurable factor if you're going to measure one single factor. We've been asked, why don't you do a nick between the sire line and the female line? Well, the answer is sire line nicks within a generation or two. In general terms, there are enough horses to get a statistically significant calculation. When it comes to mares and their daughters, and even granddaughters, it's very hard to get enough instances in general terms where a female line or a mare has been crossed with a stallion to have any degree of statistical significance.
Well, we now know that nicks are statistically valid. So are horses with A's the only ones worth breeding or buying? What do you think, Byron?
And look, this is a myth that it has raised a lot of concerns for stallion owners, and we do get stallion managers ringing us up a little bit frustrated that breeders are coming to them with what are good matings, solid matings, but it's not an A. one of the things we didn't purposefully set out to do this, but it just so happened that when we did the statistical tests on the population, the A plus and A double plus ratings are a small percentage of the population in general. So we're not talking about you know, we just don't hand them out like confetti. I'm afraid that and as a result, while people would like to get A ratings, they're actually quite hard to get. What our practical experience has been, and this is, you know, Alan and I both individually and collectively buy and recommendations and make recommendations for various clients around the world. Our collective experience has been basically when you start to talk to B plus is when we start to look at. Now we've even looked at ratings at horses that don't even rate that well, but
we bought a horse that was not rated yesterday.
Yeah.
You know.
But in general terms, we look at we try to look at horses that are B plus is where we start to say, okay, the odds start to flip into your favour at that point. So our advice to everyone that's using TrueNicks and everyone that's and we do appreciate you guys getting online and using the product, and we hope you're enjoying using the product, because we certainly enjoyed making it and developing it and practically using it. Our advice is to you is to start looking at ratings at B to B plus, and a lot of it will also depend on the quality of the horses that are in the pedigree. And that's the one great thing we've got, was if you look down and you see the best 5 horses bred on the cross. There are A rated pedigrees where you look down at the pedigree and you see the best 5 rated horses on the cross, and you know what, they're not that, you know, they're nice horses, but they're not that great horses. You could do another mating where you see a B to B plus, and you look down and there's 5 Grade 1 winners. Practically, we would say to you, that's probably a slightly better mating to try and do, given the quality of the horses that it's produced and the quality of the ancestors being used. So from the viewpoint of breeding and buying just A's, our advice is to take a step back, have a look at the pedigree, and have a look at the horses that are being produced on the cross, because that's vitally important.
Yeah, I mean, TrueNicks is very much a page of information, not just a rating. One of the most interesting examples that we've written about on the blogs and talked about over a period of time, and has evolved as a very interesting example, is Dynaformer. When we first started running results, Dynaformer with Mr. Prospector line mares was, I think, a C+, but the quality of the best stakes winners was very high. You'd had, I think, Risk Averse, Barbaro, another Grade 1 winner. And that alerted us to the fact that, okay, something is happening here, that it's not a prolific nick in terms of opportunity, but the good ones are very, very good. And that alerts you that something's probably happening with a very specific type of Mr. Prospector line mare. And that's a good hint to look at, saying, well, what evolved was the Dynaformer Mr. Prospector Cross is now an A-rated nick, because as he got used by more Europeans, as his stud fee raised and he got a different type of mare, it turns out that what he's worked very well with is the King Mambos and some of those kind of things, the turf horse. And so the early rating, although that rating wasn't high, the TrueNicks page gave you some information that was very important, gave you something that was well worth considering to do some further investigation. And what that investigation would have revealed has been borne out by later developments. So it's very important to remember, you're not buying a rating, you're getting a page that has a lot of information on it.
We've had some really great questions. Keep them coming. Well, we've learned a lot about the value of nicking. We know there's the temptation to make nicks the only criteria to consider when planning a mating.
I went out and I did the matings for a big farm down in Australia, and I had 100 and something mares, and we did the matings, and I walked out with the farm manager the first day. We had all these matings all out in a sheet, and he turned to me, he said, "Son," he said, "paper doesn't run very fast." And that is very, very true. You need to certainly look at a lot of aspects when you're planning your matings and looking at the yearlings that you might buy. And this is one factor, and it is an important factor. We've obviously statistically proven that the nick rating is irrelevant, and also we've and having experience of using the nick rating, we do think it's a very important tool, but it's not an absolute, and that's where I think people can get a little bit. It's not the silver bullet. It's not the only answer to everything, and I think that needs to be well understood. Is that it is one factor. You need to consider, the the quality of the ancestors being used. You need to physically consider the mare and the stallion. That is probably just as important, if not more important, is to look at the stallion, look at your mare and say, okay, is my mare, does she have the right temperament? Is she correct? Is she big enough? Is she, you've got to think about all the physical things about your mare and other issues, and then look at the stallion and say, I've got a mare that is a little bit excitable. I need to go to a stallion that generally gets good-tempered horses. And one of the other products which we've got is the broodmare analysis product. And I'd say to you that is another great product to use from the viewpoint of it will give you the opportunity to select multiple horses, have a look at all the ratings of these horses, get a printout of all the pedigrees, but it also give you a chance to then look down at that list and say to yourself, here is at least these might all be A-rated with my mare, but I think that this stallion that's a B+ is actually a better rating, better mating for my mare based on the physical considerations and based on other factors that you might consider when mating your mare.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's a piece of information. It's a very, very important piece of information. It's far from the only piece of information. And one of the things is, I've been involved in thoroughbreds for getting on better part of 35 years, studying pedigrees, mating for 25 years, and now probably mating several hundred horses a year. And the data set's changed, the skill set's changed. These days you have a lot of data and the skill is interpreting them. And in TrueNicks, that's one of the things we try and do, is to give as much data as possible. That's what I've said, that it's not just a page with a rating on it, it's a page with a lot of data on it. There's clues to aptitude. If you study the performance of the best horses, there's clues to the quality. But what I will say is, from the standpoint of having done matings for 25 years, I've literally done hundreds of matings a year, is that I've had TrueNicks because I had TrueNicks to play with for the better part of a year. We tried it, tested it, developed it before we went public with it. I've had the benefit of using it for a year. It's been publicly available now for the 18 months or so. That I would hate to be without it, having spent 23 years or more doing matings without it, and having spent 2 years with the use of it. I would certainly feel very deprived if I didn't have that information. And certainly I've introduced it to some very major breeders, and they've been delighted to see it, delighted to use it, and they've requested that we run it and use it with their mares. So one thing I can say from my personal experience is it's invaluable to me in my work, and I certainly wouldn't want to lose it.
Thanks very much for joining us today in the TrueNicks webinar. We hope you enjoyed listening to what Al and I discussed this, and if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us. As we said, if there is anything that we can do for you at any stage, log on to TrueNicks.com and make some comments, or if you need any feedback, there's the ability for you to send us some feedback, and we hope you enjoyed today. Thank you.
Thank you, Byron Rogers and Alan Porter, for dispelling some of the common myths about thoroughbred breeding and giving us more information about how nicking systems like TrueNicks work. A special thank you to everyone who participated in today's webinar. Stay online if you have questions. Byron and Alan will be available until 3 p.m. This webinar will be posted later on bloodhorse.com and TrueNicks.com for you to review.